There is a moment, you have had it, when you looked at someone and felt something was wrong before a single word was spoken, before the excuse, before the explanation, before the performance of normalcy that followed. Something in you registered a signal. You felt it in your chest, or your gut, or the back of your neck, and then you talked yourself out of it. You decided you were being paranoid. You decided to give the benefit of the doubt. You decided the signal was wrong. It wasn't. The signal was 40,000 years old, and it was reading information from the most honest surface the human body produces, a surface that cannot lie, that has no voluntary muscle control, that responds to internal states with a precision that no amount of social coaching can fully override. Your ancestors built their survival on reading that surface. They did it every day. They did it before language was sophisticated enough to deceive. They did it in groups small enough that every face was known and every deviation from baseline was visible. And then we built a world that replaced faces with screens, replaced groups of 15 with cities of 15 million, and systematically dismantled the most sophisticated threat detection system biological evolution ever produced. This is the investigation of what that system actually was, and what it is going to cost you to ignore it. Start with the pupil. Not the iris, the pupil. The black circle at the center of the eye that you have been looking at your entire life without understanding what it is telling you. The pupil is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, specifically by competing inputs from the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. Sympathetic activation, the biological state associated with arousal, interest, fear, threat assessment, and cognitive load, dilates the pupil. Parasympathetic dominance, associated with comfort, disengagement, and low arousal, constricts it. This process is entirely involuntary. There is no muscle in the human body that can override pupillary response to emotional state. A person can control their voice, their facial expression, their posture, their words, and their hands. They cannot control their pupils. The research on pupillary dilation as a social signal begins seriously in the 1960s with psychologist Eckhard Hess at the University of Chicago, who demonstrated that people rate photographs of faces with artificially dilated pupils as more attractive, more trustworthy, and more engaging than identical photographs with constricted pupils, without being able to articulate why. The faces looked better. Participants could not identify the manipulation. What they were responding to, without knowing it, was the biological signal that dilated pupils communicate. This person is engaged, interested, present, and aroused by positive stimuli. Constricted pupils in social contexts communicate the opposite: disengagement, hostility, or emotional withdrawal. Centuries before Hess, women in Renaissance Italy used belladonna, atropine extracted from Atropa belladonna, to dilate their pupils artificially before social encounters, because the cultural intuition that dilated pupils were attractive and trustworthy was already in circulation. They were engineering a social signal that the human nervous system was already reading without awareness. The system was running. Nobody had named it yet. Then there is eye movement. The direction and pattern of eye movement during conversation and during cognitive processing is a surface that reveals information about internal states with a specificity that most people never consciously register, but that their nervous systems are reading continuously. Lateral eye movement, eyes moving left or right during processing, reflects hemispheric activation patterns associated with different types of cognitive load. Upward eye movement is associated with visual reconstruction or construction. Downward movement correlates with emotional access or internal dialogue. The pattern itself is less important than the deviation from an individual's established baseline. A person whose eyes consistently move in one direction when accessing a specific type of information and then suddenly shifts that pattern is showing you a change in internal processing. They are showing you a cognitive state that their words have not yet disclosed. In a group of 15 people who had looked at each other's faces every day for years, deviations from established baseline eye movement patterns were detectable without conscious analysis. The nervous system logged the baseline. It noticed the deviation. It produced a signal that something had changed. The signal reached the conscious mind as intuition. The ancestral human called it knowledge. Modern psychology calls it nonverbal leakage. The mechanism is identical. Blink rate tells the third story. The average human blinks approximately 15 to 20 times per minute under normal conditions. Under elevated cognitive load, active problem solving, sustained attention, high-stakes processing, blink rate decreases. Under emotional stress, anxiety, or deception, Particularly when a person is constructing rather than retrieving information, blink rate typically increases, then decreases sharply during the period of maximum cognitive effort required to maintain a false narrative, then increases again as the person returns to a more relaxed state. The pattern is not universal and varies significantly across individuals, which is precisely why baseline calibration matters. An individual whose blink rate you know from hundreds of hours of normal interaction produces a legible signal when that rate deviates. A stranger's blink rate tells you very little. A person you have watched daily for 3 years tells you everything. The ancestral group of 15 people knew each other at a resolution that made the blink rate data meaningful. The modern world has systematically eliminated the social conditions under which that resolution is achievable. The Dunbar number, the cognitive limit on stable social relationships that British anthropologist Robin Dunbar calculated at approximately 150 individuals, with an inner circle of approximately 15, is not merely a social observation. It is a neurological one. The neocortex ratio in social primates correlates with the typical group size of each species. The human neocortex is sized, roughly, for a social world of 150 meaningful relationships, with daily intimate contact with approximately 15. And within that inner group of 15, the human face processing system, centered in the fusiform face area of the right temporal lobe, operates at a resolution that is qualitatively different from its operation on unfamiliar faces. Familiar faces activate more complex neural networks, produce faster recognition responses, and generate richer associative data, including behavioral prediction, emotional baseline assessment, and deviation detection than unfamiliar faces do. The system evolved for a world where the 15 faces you saw every day were the faces that determined whether you ate, whether you were safe, whether you could trust the person standing beside you with a weapon. Getting those faces wrong had immediate, potentially lethal consequences. The system was calibrated by stakes that modern social environments almost never produce. Consider what daily face-to-face contact in a Paleolithic group actually looked like. No mediated communication, no written messages, no voice calls, no emoji to soften or amplify tone. The entirety of social information transfer happened in physical proximity, in real time, with full access to the face, the eyes, the posture, and the autonomic nervous system signals that those surfaces expressed. A member of the group who was concealing information, food location, mating interest, aggressive intent, illness, was concealing it in the only medium available, the face. And the group around them had been reading that face, in that context, under those conditions, every day. The calibration was continuous. It was involuntary. The nervous system was running a constant facial recognition and deviation detection process as background computation, the way your visual system processes depth and motion without conscious instruction. The output was not a conscious analysis. It was a feeling that something was off, a feeling that a person was hiding something. A feeling, precise, rapid, and frequently correct, that preceded any verbal information that would later confirm it. What modern life has done to this system is not destroy it. The hardware is intact. The fusiform face area in your brain is the same structure. The autonomic nervous system pathways are the same. The pupillary response mechanisms are the same. What has changed is the calibration data and the exposure frequency. The average American adult spends approximately 11 hours per day in front of screens, consuming faces that are mediated, edited, curated, and in many cases algorithmically selected to produce specific emotional responses. These faces do not produce the kind of calibration data that daily physical proximity produces. A face on a screen cannot be read for pupillary dilation at conversational distance. The blink rate data is not accessible. The microexpressions, fleeting facial movements lasting between 1/25th and 1/5 of a second that reflect genuine emotional state before voluntary suppression can occur, are compressed, pixelated, or simply too small to register on standard display resolutions. The calibration system is still running. It is running on inadequate data, and the social world it is trying to navigate has expanded from 15 known faces to millions of strangers, reducing the baseline data on which deviation detection depends to near zero for most of the interactions that matter most in modern life. But here is where the investigation turns. Because what has been described so far, the pupillary dilation, the eye movement patterns, the blink rate signals, the baseline calibration, is not a historical curiosity about how ancient humans read faces. It is a description of a system that is running in you right now. Right now, as you watch this, your fusiform face area is processing faces. Your autonomic nervous system is generating internal states in response to social signals. Your body is producing feelings, hunches, discomforts, inexplicable attractions and repulsions that are the output of a face-reading system that has been operational for hundreds of thousands of years. The question is not whether the system works. The research is unambiguous. The system works. The question is whether you are listening to it. Think about the last person who deceived you in a way that cost you something real, not a small social lie, a deception that had consequences, a relationship that turned out to be something other than what it presented itself as, a professional betrayal, a personal breach of trust. Now ask yourself honestly, was there a moment, before the deception became undeniable, when you felt something? When you noticed something in an interaction that produced a signal you could not name and did not act on? When you talked yourself out of an intuition because the verbal evidence contradicted it, or because acting on the feeling seemed irrational, or because the social cost of being wrong was higher than the cost of ignoring the signal? The answer, for most people, is yes. Not always, not with certainty, but often enough that the pattern is not coincidence. The signal was there. You had learned in the specific environment of modern social life to override it. This is the thing that most discussions of body language and nonverbal communication miss entirely. They present the skill as something to be learned, a technique to be applied, a checklist of signals to watch for. But the system is not a technique. It is a biological capacity that requires calibration through physical proximity and repetition to produce reliable output. The ancient human did not study body language. They lived in conditions that automatically produced the calibration data the system requires. The information was in their body before it reached their consciousness. The modern human has the same system and a fraction of the calibration data and has been taught by a culture that valorizes explicit verbal reasoning above all other forms of knowledge to discount the output of a system that evolution spent hundreds of thousands of years refining. The result is not that you cannot read people. The result is that you can and have been systematically taught not to trust what you read. Here is what the science has established with sufficient clarity to state directly. The human face reading system, when operating on familiar faces in conditions of regular physical proximity, produces threat detection and social assessment accuracy rates that exceed conscious analytical reasoning in speed and, in many conditions, in accuracy. Paul Ekman's work on microexpressions, validated across decades of research and multiple cultural contexts, demonstrated that emotional states are expressed in the face involuntarily, briefly, and with a specificity that trained observers can learn to read, but that untrained observers already partially register as gut feelings they cannot explain. The signal is real. The system that produces it is real. The calibration that makes it reliable is achievable. What is required is not a course in body language. What is required is the recovery of conditions that the ancestral social environment provided automatically. Regular, sustained, unmediated physical proximity to a small number of people whose faces you know well enough to read deviation from baseline. The technology that replaced those conditions did not replace the system that depended on them. It simply starved it of data. The system is waiting. And every face you look at, really look at, without a screen between you, in sustained proximity, without the social pressure to look away, is feeding it what it has been missing. There is a particular loneliness in the modern world that is very difficult to name precisely. It is not the loneliness of being physically alone. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people you cannot read, people whose faces you see through mediated surfaces, whose signals you cannot calibrate, whose internal states remain opaque despite constant contact. The ancestral human in a group of 15 people knew those people at a resolution that most modern adults never achieve with anyone. They knew their faces the way you know a road you have driven 1,000 times, not by reading the signs, but by the feeling of the road itself. The signal in the eyes was not magic. It was information. Dense, reliable, biologically precise information, produced by a nervous system that cannot lie, and received by a nervous system evolved to read it. We built a world that put screens between those two nervous systems. We called it connection. The eyes are still talking. The question is whether you have forgotten how to listen.